Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in to this week's edition of Stop, Look, and Listen. I'm your host, Fitzroy Gardner. This week, we have a special guest. We have a medical oncologist and hematologist with over 30 years as an academic and biotech executive. He currently serves as a principal clinical consultant at Data Revive. We have Dr. Fitzroy Dawkins. Welcome to the show, Dr. Dawkins.
Troy, thank you for having me. I look forward to talking with you, and thanks again for the invite. Thanks so much.
Oh, sure. I mean, it's always important, especially on this platform, to touch on issues that are meaningful to our community. And I think this conversation will accomplish that goal.
Okay. Certainly hope so. I certainly hope I can help in that regard.
All right, cool. So, just take us on a fantastic voyage into the childhood of a young Dr. Dawkins.
Oh, wow. So very briefly, I grew up in the West Indies, in the islands, as they say, specifically in Jamaica. Pretty much a country boy. Mom is a nurse there, and trained in the UK as a nurse. Came back home, and over time, I saw her work and her commitment to her patients. Commitment to the community, where she was a nurse, the doctor, the dentist, the everything in the bushes, so to speak, until the doctor showed up. And that made a tremendous impact on me. The other impact that I had in terms of my journey towards becoming a doctor is that I was really sick as a kid. For between the ages of 10 through 11, 12 years old, I was really quite sick, and they couldn't quite figure out what was wrong with me. And I spent a heck of a lot of time in the hospital there, on an adult ward as a young boy, 10, 11 years old, where I witnessed quite a bit of things. But in the process of being in the hospital for a 5-month stint at times, I had a tremendous doctor, Dr. Golding. John Golding. He's a surgeon, was from the UK, but he came and he took great care of me. And I noticed, even as a child, how careful he was and how caring he was. So just to give you a little bit of a background, because Jamaica is part of the British system, the British Commonwealth, for me at the time to go to high school, I had to win a national scholarship. I had to sit an exam. I had to win a national scholarship. And at the time that I was in the hospital was a time that I had to sit that scholarship. And if I missed that opportunity, I may never go to high school because my folks just didn't have that kind of funds to send me to a private high school. And in the process of taking care of me, he looked at the social worker and said, isn't this boy supposed to be sitting in the common entrance, is what it's just called? And she said, yes. And he said, see what you can do for him because the time has passed. And she looked into it. She reached out to the Ministry of Education in Jamaica, and they allowed me to sit that examination all by myself after all my colleagues throughout the nation had finished their examinations. And I passed it, thank God. And I went on to a very good high school, Manchester High School, and then Wilmer's Boys School. So that was the second piece for me, the fact that he did such a great job of taking care of me and that he saw me beyond just a patient. The other piece for me is that I learned science. I loved science. I loved the whole idea of science and delving into science and biology and physics and chemistry. So that's a big influence as well. The other influence for me was I became a Christian at 14, and I began to think about what that means. What does that mean practically in terms of my journey through life? And I thought combining those factors together, that becoming a physician was perhaps the best thing for me. And you couple that with the fact that I saw some really horrific things as a child in the hospital. One example I saw at an outlying hospital where I was placed is that there was one doctor for the whole hospital, one. And one weekend, when it was his weekend to be off and no one to cover him, I saw somebody literally dying in front of my eyes in the hospital after a motor vehicle accident. The nurses couldn't help him. They did what they could, but he died. There was no doctor to take him to surgery. And I thought, my God, I must be able to do something about this. And so those are some sort of pivotal moments in my life that combined made me decide that becoming a physician was the right thing for me. So thanks for the question.
Oh, sure. I mean, you definitely answered the question I had in mind next was that moment where that calling started to fester and whether you answered it immediately. Did you have any thoughts of deviating and going in another direction, or you knew immediately that this is what you wanted to practice?
Well, so again, that's an interesting question and very insightful because so here I was 14, 15, 16, and in Jamaica at the time, you could finish high school at 16 or 17 years old. And the other path that I thought about, quite honestly, was becoming a pastor. So
Mm-hmm.
in some ways, sort of the two things are sort of overlapping each other in so many ways. Is caring for people, caring for the community. And I struggled with that, but I thought, maybe becoming a physician might be a better path for me. And so those were the two, you know, dominant thoughts in my mind. The third, if there was ever one, was I loved history. I still love history. I had a teacher who was a tremendous influence on me from in teaching me history. And so I thought at times maybe I could become a history professor. So I toyed with that idea, but I thought from a practical standpoint, what I thought the country needed was to have doctors who could take care of patients and be perhaps a substitute for that one doctor who was the only doctor in that hospital for Lord knows how many years. So those are the
Mm-hmm.
three prongs that I considered, but I landed on being a physician and I've never regretted it.
Right. So did you stay on the homeland in Jamaica to practice, or like when did you make your way here to the United States?
So I made my way to answer the question directly. I made my way to New York City as an 18-year-old, um, a very reluctant 18-year-old. I mean, this is Jamaica. There's sunshine, there's beaches, there's things to do, fun things for a young man to do. And I had let's say, I had a meaningful conversation with my mother over the course of many months. And she decided I should go to the United States. And I decided I was not going to go to the United States. Why would I want to leave Jamaica? So it was a tussle. But at 18, post high school, I landed at Kennedy Airport and began that journey that my mother thought was the best one for me.
Okay. All right. So as a seasoned academic and biotech executive, like just talk about how you balance those roles when it comes to clinical practice, research, and industry leadership.
All right, thanks for that. So a little bit of history again. As I said, I'm obsessed about history, so I want to give you a little bit of the background.
Mm-hmm.
So I went to college in New York City, City University of New York, one of the York College specifically. I then went to Buffalo Medical School in Buffalo, New York, for my medical school and my residency. And then I left there and went to George Washington University for my fellowship in hematology oncology. And then I went across town to Howard University because I looked at a number of places. I looked at University of Maryland to become an academic, and I looked at Howard, and I thought Howard is a better choice for me. I got
Mm-hmm.
there. I spent 14 years there, and it was some of the most exciting years of my life because in the process of going to Howard, having been turned down by the medical establishment in Jamaica from coming back home to give up my services, I felt that I owed the African American community a special debt of gratitude for the path that they created for me to come from someplace else as a black man and to go to medical school. So Howard was that perfect outlet for me. And so the idea of training the next generation of Black physicians, primarily Black physicians, the
Mm-hmm.
idea of caring for patients who were on the front lines before I got to this country was a meaningful piece for me. The other piece was the recognition that cancer is still a deadly disease and more research needs to be done. And I felt that I should throw myself into that from a research standpoint to do what I can from a patient care standpoint. And as I said before, to begin to train the next generation of Black physicians to replace me at some point in time. So that's Howard University over 14 years. For family reasons and for other reasons, I decided to go to work for Johnson Johnson in New Jersey, just outside the
Mm-hmm.
Boston area, and but still with a passion for research. And so we did that. It was it was a challenging transition because in my mind, I'm a doctor. I'm going to work in a biotech pharmaceutical area. I know what patients need. I have my own concepts as to what needs to be done. And I was told in no uncertain terms initially by my vice president, Fitzroy, sit down and let me tell you something. You don't know what you don't know.
Right.
So it was a rough beginning for me, but over time I transitioned into doing more clinical research, still making the case that we need to do more for African Americans at all levels in terms of exposing them to clinical trials, recruit them to clinical trials, and to think about the diseases that are unique to African Americans. So I did that, Johnson Johnson, for 8.5 years. Then I went to a company called Insight in Wilmington, Delaware. I spent 6 years there and helped to develop a drug that is now approved for use. And then I went to work for a company in Boston in the pandemic, 2020, remotely, working on sickle cell disease and prostate cancer. Again, two major diseases in the African American community. And then in 2021, I took a break and then I began working for this company that where I currently am as a consultant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Bravo, very commendable. So I wanted, like pre-interview, I mentioned that I have a connection
Yes.
to the world of hematology and oncology. My wife actually is a sickle cell physician.
Really?
We're based in South Florida. She works at Memorial Hospital.
Oh, wow.
Dr. Joy Agunshale.
Oh, I don't.
Yeah, so that's my wife.
Oh,
Yep. So I hear every day just, the struggles of, advocating and trying to take care of the African American community when it comes to sickle cell.
hmm.
And then obviously, that physician circle is kind of tight. So some of her closest friends, one is an oncologist at Brady in Atlanta,
Yes.
uh, Dr. J. Jones.
Hmm.
So,
Don't think I
yeah.
know her.
Okay. Yeah, so it's just I like I said, I totally commend you for all of the work. And so like my question is like just talk about how difficult it is not only to advocate for African Americans when it comes to getting these programs and the research done, getting the approval, like from Johnson and Johnson and you know companies that kind of neglect us a lot of times, but also to gain the um, acceptance from the patients themselves, the patients to believe in the work that you're doing, to trust you with their bodies.
Yes, and thanks for that. It's a great series of questions because that's in part one of the reasons why I wrote the book. So thank you again.
Mm-hmm.
For me, having left Howard, I felt a little uneasy because I felt like I was leaving the patients behind. Right.
Mm-hmm.
The goal again in my pursuit was to say I can take care of one patient at a time, but if we can be part of a story that helps to develop a drug, you could impact thousands of patients' lives. So that was part of the conversation that I was having with my vice president. And one of the things that I realized is that very often, once I got to the industry, the driving force was, yes, an interest in patients, but it was also a business.
Mm-hmm.
And so the question is, if we invest X of millions of dollars, will I get a return on my investment? Will I get a return on my investment for the investors, for the stockholders, what have you? And if you couldn't make that case, it was hard to move ahead, even though the need was there. So I don't know that I achieved a tremendous amount of success in that regard because, again, I was relatively junior, sort of a mid level. I wasn't a vice president at the time or any of that sort of thing. So my voice in a company that was thousands of persons was minor. What has happened is that there is this resurgence, for example, in sickle cell disease drug development. And part of it is that there was an incentivization by the FDA, incentivization by the government to say if you pursue these goals and these objectives, you will get certain perhaps tax breaks, what have you. So that's one initiative. The other initiative is that a big company, a huge company that makes, I don't know, $10 billion a year in sales, they may say to themselves, you know, sickle cell disease, and I'm using sickle cell disease as an example.
Mm-hmm.
We have 100,000 persons throughout the United States, 110 with sickle cell disease. Most of those patients are going to be on Medicaid, which doesn't pay quite as well as a private insurance. And they're making that calculation as to whether or not they want to go in that direction. So they may say to themselves, it's going to cost us too much to take that risk. What we will do is we will we will identify a small company, a startup, who has an interest in this area. We will fund them. Most of them are going to be unsuccessful, but if one of them is successful, we'll swoop in, we'll buy them, and we'll market the drug. So it's a question of de-risking finances.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and what has happened is, again, a little bit of history. In 1992, a drug called hydroxyurea was approved for sickle cell disease, the first drug approved. And since then, for the next, I'd say, 20 years, nothing new had happened in sickle cell in terms of new drug development. And then suddenly, over the last 5, 6 years, there have been a tremendous amount of, I think, 5 or 6 compounds now have been approved for sickle cell disease with varying degrees of efficacy. And of course, the other thing that you would know from talking to your wife and maybe your own research is that this
Yeah.
whole area of gene therapy has become
Yeah.
a thing.
Yeah. I was just about to mention that.
Yeah, it's pretty
Mm-hmm.
exciting stuff. And so we're seeing a sea change for different reasons that the industry is now beginning to look at this as a potential monetizing disease. Now, I'm not suggesting that all companies are like that, but I'm saying that there's a prevailing thought of we need to do good, but we also need to make money.
Right.
So that was part of the challenge that I didn't quite understand when I got to industry. I just thought it's all about doing good. And if I can
Mm-hmm.
make the argument, then we should be good to go.
Right. All right. So, like, define the concept of good medicine in the context of clinical trials. Like, what role do you believe they play in revolutionizing cancer care?
So that's a great question. And I, just give me a few minutes to sort of maybe develop the thought.
Okay.
I'll switch. I won't continue to pick on sickle cell disease. Let me switch to cancer.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in the book that I wrote, while at Howard University, I took care of quite a few patients who were afraid of clinical trials. They didn't want to hear the word because there's a long history associated with quote unquote research in the Black community. And this particular person that I wrote about in the book came into me with cancer of the pancreas. So we're still talking about the 1990s, late 1990s, maybe early 2000. And he was stage 4, and pancreatic cancer is just absolutely one of the worst diseases that you could possibly have. And I sat him down and I said, Mr. So-and-so, here's a story. You've got stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Here are my options, or here are your options. Surgery is not going to do any good for you. Radiation therapy by itself is not going to do much for you. Chemotherapy, which is what you need at this point, is of limited value. Consider the possibility of going on a clinical trial. And he said to me, Dr. Dawkins, I don't want to be a guinea pig. Whatever it is that you've been given to your other patients with pancreatic cancer before, I am willing to take that, because if it doesn't help anyone else, it will help me. So there is a belief without the facts that I was sharing with him. So why am I telling that story? Because in my view, clinical trials is good medicine when there is nothing better than what is considered to be the standard of care, or when the standard of care have run out and there's nothing else to offer the patient except palliative therapy. I think that the clinical trials gives you an opportunity to contribute to the progress of the next generation of treatments. So if you go for stage 1 clinical trial, the early stage, the questions being asked there are different. It's not, the question typically is not, is this new medication that has not been tested before in humans going to cure me? We want to see how we can establish a safe dose to move it forward to the next stage. Is it too toxic? Do we have the right dose? Do we need to move it on to stage 2? But without getting into the granularities of the clinical trial, which I certainly would like to do, if you're not helping yourself by doing this, you are thinking down the road to the next generation, perhaps your kids or your brother or your sister, where some of these answers will be obtained. And it will be useful for them, even if it doesn't help you. And occasionally, you do have early phase trials that have been, I talk about that in the book as well, that have been very effective in terms of even curing some patients. So that's a very early stage where people really think about being a guinea pig or not want to participate. But there are also phase 3 trials where the drug has been proven to be safe. And in the case of cancer, let's say pancreatic cancer, where the survival, 5% 5-year survival, and that's optimistic. If there's a new drug out there that has been tested before and shows promise, and you get put on that trial where you could be randomized to participate in that trial, you could potentially gain from it an additional 5 months, 6 months, 12 months. We don't know. So that, to me, investigating that arm is an important piece. And the last piece I'd say is that there are certain diseases that seem to be uniquely problematic cancers in the African American community. You take a disease, something called multiple myeloma, as an example. You take something called triple negative breast cancer, where the rates among African Americans are twice as much as the white population. And we don't know for sure why that is. We just know that people die younger, they're diagnosed earlier, and the treatments that have been developed may not be quite as effective for some of them. So the question is, what is there something unique about these diseases, as an example, that need new medications to increase the probability of cure? And so, from that standpoint, I think helping ourselves by participating in clinical trials, if not ourselves, our families and the next generation, in my view, is good medicine. And the last thing I'd say around good medicine is that when you're on a clinical trial, you get a tremendous amount of care that you probably would not have gotten going to see your regular doctor, because everything has got to be documented. All the questions have got to be answered. All your side effects are assessed and so forth. So in that sense, you get really the best care when you're on a clinical trial.
Right. So obviously we know the historical context of the Tuskegee experiment,
Mhm.
and like I'll say I have relatives that avoid going to the doctor at all costs, like a great grandmother who never went until she passed away. And there's other family members the same thing. They just they've heard or experienced um, situations where they felt like there was malpractice and mistreatment. So just talk about what measures do you think should be taken to ensure the ethical conduct of these clinical trials and the trust is built within our communities?
So again, a great question, and sort of gets to the heart of the reason why I wrote the book. First of
Mm-hmm.
all, not to get too complex about it, but Tuskegee is called a Tuskegee trial, Tuskegee experiment. But in reality, Tuskegee was not a clinical trial, not
Okay.
in the sense that we understand it today.
Mm-hmm.
Tuskegee was a lie told to a very specific set of people to get certain results, to make certain people famous, and to give them information that will help the other, and not the community that they entered into. So there was a lot of deception, there was a lot of lies, and it was not scientifically objective.
Okay.
So, and that message is hard to get across. The second piece is that a tremendous amount of change has occurred because of the suffering of African Americans and Black people. When Tuskegee happened, it made the nation and the country go through a revolution in terms of how they think about this, because they realized that something evil took place here. The nice thing about that, if you would, is that everybody benefited because of the disaster that took place at Tuskegee.
Mm-hmm.
So part of what I think we need to do is to tell the story that Tuskegee, the probability of Tuskegee happening again is substantially reduced because of the safety measures. You can sue if somebody is doing something unethical to you. Um, you are allowed to ask questions. You are, if before you participate in a clinical trial, an informed consent is given to you, which can be taken home, which can be discussed with your pastor, can be discussed with your kids, can be discussed with whomever. And you have the right to ask questions about what it is and get that explained to you very well. So those are only some of the measures that have been taken since Tuskegee. The problem that I think that we're having is that the people who want to do these clinical trials don't necessarily feel themselves as part of the community. They don't necessarily see themselves, they see themselves as researchers. And,
Mm-hmm.
and so I think that there needs to be an attempt, a continuous attempt on the part of clinical trialists, if you would, to change that narrative. And I think one way to do that is to train people who look like the patients who we're asked to participate in the trial. I'm more likely to trust you because you look like me. I don't think you lied to me. Um, versus somebody who comes in, wants you to sign a piece of paper, put you in a clinical trial, and they don't see you again. So I think that there needs to be more training in the community. there needs to be a continuation of involvement in the community even after the clinical trials are done. Patients don't understand why a, clin- a sponsor, a pharmaceutical company, a biotech company comes in, offers a clinical trial, and when the results are over, they never see them again.
No.
The results are good. We're going to make some money out of this, and we'll see you. We won't see you again until the next time. And patients don't understand that. One of the ways that that is changing is the taxpayer dollars that we pay to the government. Some of that goes to the National Institutes of Health. And the National Institutes of Health has bodies where they are funding investigators in their own community, people that the patients can trust, people that the patients see and know and understand, physicians, I mean, and nurses,
Hmm.
who can help them to break down to at their level exactly what they're being asked to do. And I think that there needs to be more of that. I think pharmaceutical companies need to spend more money in the community to build the infrastructure for patients and to build the trust. I think the trust works both ways, right? I
Right.
think patients are afraid many times, and I think the industry needs to reach out to them like they did in COVID. They did that
Hmm.
in COVID, but there's a tremendous amount of pressure on the pharmaceutical companies to have a more diverse patient population in their clinical trials to make the results more meaningful.
Right.
And they began to do that, and I'm hoping that they won't pull back from that at this point.
All right. So, like, what steps can they take to improve the recruitment efforts?
I think one, as I said, there aren't as many African American physicians who are trained to do clinical trials. It's very rigorous, it's very specific, it's very data driven. There's something called good clinical practice that they need to be trained in, and they need to be available on a regular basis with their data to the companies that they work with. So I think that there needs to be more training. When I was at Howard, Pfizer and other companies took me to another city, sat me down for 2 days, and said, "This is what a clinical trial looks like." Because I didn't get a lot of that in my own training. I got trained very well as an oncologist, but my experience as a clinical trialist and the rigor that is needed there, I didn't have as much of that. They took a bunch of us and sort of said, "Here is what you need to do." So I think we need to train more doctors. We need to train more physicians, and I think the companies need to hire people internally who have these sensitivities and who can speak into their existence, um, because they're coming out of the same community. The representation at the highest level in pharma very often does not reflect the general population. And so I think that there has to be that. I think the boards need to be more diversified because I may work for company X, but a lot of the things that I do is based on an executive level or a board level who says we're going to spend X amount of dollars, and these are the clinical trials we're going to do. My job very often is to execute and not necessarily to ask a question. But if they don't understand the community and what the needs are and what the urgency is, then that will continue and be perpetuated unless somebody is in the boardroom to help them to understand exactly what's needed. Um, One of the encouraging things that I find is that there are a number of companies now, black-owned companies, who are a business, and their business is to help the pharmaceutical companies to understand what it means to go into a community, understand the community, and how to recruit those patients. What does it take? Meetings with church leaders, meeting with community leaders, bringing people along slowly, identifying where the patients are that they need, um, and what the patients need to participate. Sometimes a lot of African American patients say, I want to participate in a clinical trial. I understand the significance of it. But, frankly, I have to work. And if you're expecting me to come in 10 days, every day for the next 10 days for a clinical trial, I can't do it. So, or transportation is an issue, or childcare is an issue. And a number of companies are now saying those don't have to be barriers. We can cover travel expenses, we can cover a number of these things to make it possible for you to participate in the clinical trial. And I'd say lastly, I part of what I wrote the book about is to say we need to make a lot more noise.
Mm-hmm.
We need to be much more assertive about what our needs are. And rather than being invited to participate in a clinical trial, ask about them and not shy away from them. Because a lot of doctors, some doctors will look at you and say, well, my experience is that if this is an African American patient, they are going to tell me no. And it's going to be half an hour after I spent my time talking to them. And so I won't even bother. And that's an assumption on their part that the patient would not participate. So the patient has to be proactive in that respect, is what I'm saying.
Right.
Dr. Todd McLean provides periodontal and dental implant services in 2 convenient locations. They offer over a decade of experience treating patients, and appointments can even be scheduled in the evenings, weekends, or early mornings. Give them a call in Chapel Hill at 919-537-9774 or in Durham at 919-484-8338 or visit them online at gumsandimplants.org.
Yeah, and I was gonna just say, just I guess having a front row seat to my wife's journey at the moment. I guess it's difficult for her to research, practice, and be a physical presence in the community. And like you said, there's a shortage of people of color in the field, and um, the recruitment needs to be amped up tremendously.
Yes. Yeah. But it doesn't have to be her alone. So one of the cases we have made to the pharmaceutical industry is it doesn't the doctor ultimately is responsible, but they can hire, let's call them ancillary personnel that can spend that time with the patient, hold the patient's hand, help them to understand, answer their questions. And after they get to a certain point, they come to your wife, and your wife says, all right, do you understand what was said? Do you understand what's on page 6 of the long informed consent of 5 pages, 10 pages, 20 pages? Do you have any questions? What is it that you need to understand? What is it that you're afraid of before you're willing to sign this consent? Do you need to take the consent form and discuss it with your pastor? So it doesn't all have to be on your wife, but I also understand, because I was at Howard and wearing 5, 10 different hats, how difficult that is.
Mm-hmm. All right, cool. So, let's just, as we prepare to wind down, just talk about the current role, as a principal clinical consultant at Data Revive. I know you mentioned that you're at that stage where you're trying to shape and mold the future. Just talk about that and, some of the breakthroughs and advancements that you're excited about when it comes to some of this treatment.
Well, first, at Data Revive, my role is shifted a little bit. So I'm a consultant now, and I'm a consultant to a lot of companies that are either in the United States or in China,
Mm-hmm.
where they have new compounds, new drugs that they're trying to get through the regulatory process through the FDA. And so I am not as much, say, as when I was at J&J, involved in actually executing and monitoring the trials as I was before. But one of the things that I've done is, because of some initiative on the FDA's part, which says now that if you're going to do a trial in the United States, wherever you're from, China, India, Europe, whatever, you have got to guarantee a percentage. It's not a quota, but it's saying that you must address this issue of diversity. You cannot continue to have 90% of your patients being white and then get positive results and then say, well, it's positive, so it applies to everyone. And one of the things that I've had the opportunity to do is to write a blog that is going to go up in China on, you've probably heard of something called WeChat. That's the equivalent there, that talks about the need for diversity, even if they come from China, the need for diversity in clinical trials, and what kinds of things they need to do to ensure that their clinical trial recruitment is diverse. Because if they don't, the agency has sort of flipped the script and sort of said, we no longer are going to just allow you to walk in and get your drug approved. You've got to show some hard evidence of what you did, how you did it, and how many patients are involved in this process. So it's a message that I continue to preach, if you would, even though my role has changed somewhat. So in terms of things that have changed, certainly we talked at the top of the half an hour or so about how sickle cell disease has changed. The treatment for sickle cell disease has changed. One of the things that I'm very excited about, and I mentioned in the book, is the vaccine against a virus called HPV virus, which is the number one reason for cervical cancer. Right? That took a long time to come to birth, but I'm very excited about that because it's about prevention. It's about preventing a disease that is most likely to happen if the virus is not stopped, right? So that is something that I find very exciting. And I'm continuing to think more. So I'm an oncologist, right? So I'm the guy you come to see, or you used to come to see when I was at Howard, after the disease had left from stage 1 and has gone to stage 4 metastatic disease, right? And I know I can help you, but I can only help you so much.
Right.
The thing for me is more and more and more about prevention. We worked on a drug when I was at Howard for preventing breast cancer. And I'm very proud of that study because the drug eventually got approved by the FDA as a cancer prevention for breast cancer. It had some issues, it had some side effects, but it did work and showed that if you're at risk for breast cancer, if you fall into certain categories of breast cancer, you can actually reduce that rate by 50% if you take the drug. The other area of excitement, I think, is something called CRISPR, where they're now using this new technology. It's not new anymore, but they can actually use this technology like a pair of scissors. And if your disease is genetically based, you can actually use this biologic platform to snip out the gene that may be associated with that disease. And so you don't have that disease anymore, or you risk of developing that anymore. And I think that's going to revolutionize things, because now, as long as you can show that the gene is clearly associated with disease X, you can actually remove that. So ultimately, you may never need to see a guy like a medical oncologist to treat your stage 4. So the revolution is taking place. We understand now what cancer is much more than we did 50 years ago. There's tremendous advancement in prostate cancer, even lung cancer, which is the big killer in African American community. There are data showing now that if you identify the disease early enough using certain CAT scan procedures, screening with a CAT scan, you can pick up disease a lot earlier, and you can surgically remove the lesion that you see long before the patient even realizes that they have symptoms. And then that disease is unlikely to become a problem somewhere down the road. So if you hear me talking more about risk reduction, cancer risk reduction, and cancer prevention, that is where I think the research needs to go. And I think that more and more patients are saying that. Why are you chasing the horse after it's gone through the barn door? It's hard to bring them back. Why don't you shut the barn door with preventive measures? The problem for me is that a lot of African Americans will not even begin to think and talk about that because either one, they have no symptoms, or two, they don't want to know and they're afraid and they put their head in the sand and until it becomes too late.
Mhm.
So
Okay. All right. So, Dr. Dawkins, what do you find most rewarding in your career?
I find it very rewarding that I believe that I have made an impact on the community in terms of my practice, in terms of my advocacy, and having a platform for that advocacy. And to be honest with you, I'm kind of winding down my career in many ways. And the book that I've written here, I found very satisfying because it forced me to think through and put down on paper some of the thoughts that I've had for 30 plus years. It forced me to that year of hiatus that I said I had between Boston and starting this new job. It forced me to put down on paper some of my hopes, some of my dreams of what I would like to see in the African American community. And I'm hoping that a book like this will get read in the community and that it will move people and that we will begin to turn the ship so that we begin to feel like not outsiders, but we are Americans. and, and everything that is due to any American is due us. And so we need to go grab it and take it, just like we did with the civil rights movement. We weren't shy about that. We weren't shy about playing sports. We dominate a number of sports right now. And I think we need to sort of have that same attitude in terms of our healthcare, not to hide our head in the sand, but to face it head on and demand and seize the day, if you would. So I have no regrets in looking back about your first question. Was it what drove me as a boy in Jamaica to become a physician? I'm very thankful that this country has given me that opportunity. And I would like to believe that I did not waste the opportunity.
Okay. All right. So, plug the book. Just briefly tell us about some of the good medicine in the book, where we can find it, and then where we can find you on social media.
So the book is Fighting for Survival, Conquering Cancer and the African American Patient. And what I write in there, I use my personal story of 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 identifying with an African community which I did not grow up with in my early years, but I use my personal story of struggle, the racism that I faced in Buffalo, the Confederate flag guys who stopped me on the street at 2 o'clock in the morning and threatened me, the people who painted my car nigger. And I'm saying, I'm not telling the story because I'm vain. I'm telling the story to say that despite all of that, you can come through and you've got to put things in perspective. So that's one of the reasons why I told the story. In the story, in the book, I talk about people with hope. There is a young woman, who's, as far as I know, still alive, who had leukemia, pride and joy of her West African parents, at a university in Washington, D.C., who had leukemia and who was kicked out of the hospital that should have admitted her to our hospital. And she fought with me tooth and nail. She didn't even think I knew what I was doing. She literally said that to me, a 19-year-old, do you know what you're doing? because I
Right.
was so sick from the treatment. And she survived. She survived to get married and have children after 2 years of treatment. It's a story about a young woman from South Asia who kept telling people she got abdominal pain. She went to the emergency room. She said they told her she had peptic ulcers, stomach ulcers. And she says, my sister died at 32 years old with ovarian cancer in my old country. Do you think this is what it could be? And they said, no, take this medicine and call the doctor in the morning. She went to a second emergency room with the same complaint, and they gave her the same story. She came to Howard University emergency room and complained of the same thing. They sent her to a gastroenterologist, and the gastroenterologist said to me, Fitzroy, this lady does not have stomach cancer. She doesn't have stomach ulcers. She has something else. It turned out at 32 years old, she had ovarian cancer, stage 3 ovarian cancer. And the story for me is multifold. One, she insisted, based on her family history, that there is something else going on here, and you need to take care of the fact that my sister died at a young age, around the age that she was at that time. So she knew her family history. And so
Mm-hmm.
part of my plea to the African American community is we need to talk to each other about what our history is, not just Tuskegee, but what our medical history is, because it could be genetically driven. And you need to share that information with your kids. You need to share that information with your cousins. You need to talk about it and not ignore it. The other part for me is that this woman is still alive 25 years later. 25 years later with stage 3 ovarian cancer. She reaches out to me every Christmas and sends me a gift. She's alive. And I think if she was not advocating, which is the other word I want to throw out there, if she was not advocating for herself, she may not be alive today. So knowing your history, sharing your history, and knowing your body, and knowing that something more than what you're being told is going on is an important part of the conversation. And lastly, talk to your physician. Talk to them. I spent a tremendous amount of time with her on the phone after she got chemotherapy. Her toes were hurting because she had something called neuropathy. She was vomiting. She lost her hair, but she stuck with it. She stuck with it, and she survived. So um, I'm speaking about self-advocacy, and I'll give you another tearjerker story. Since you asked, another woman, elderly woman, 60 plus, I think she was at the time, was told she came from the islands to visit her daughter, and she said she had a clean bill of health by the doctor there. And she came to the States because her first grandchild was about to be born. And to this day, I still get very emotional about that. And she went to see a doctor in Washington, D.C., and the doctor says, I think you have ovarian cancer. And she says, they gave me a clean bill of health 2 months ago. What do you mean? She comes to me, to Howard, and we look at her. We got a biopsy. In fact, she had ovarian cancer. And in fact, it was stage 4 ovarian cancer. And when we decided how we're going to treat her, the surgeons and myself and others, the team, she looked at me and she says, Dr. Dawkins, am I going to live to see my first grandchild? And I said to her, I don't know, but I will do the best I can for you. And she lived. She lived to see her first grandchild. She lived to see her second grandchild. And after 4 years after diagnosis, unfortunately, she passed away. But for me, that's a success. That is something that says, stick with it, work with the doctors, ask questions, self-advocate, and get the best care that you can by whatever means necessary.
Wow. That's so powerful and poignant way to end this week's episode of Stop, Look, and Listen. Um, yeah, know your history, share your history, advocate, and communicate with your physician. Um, Dr. Dawkins, it's been a pleasure just to sit and listen and learn, from you, and just give us hope for, some of the um, trauma as a people that we've faced, and that we can overcome it, with people like you, um, fighting the good fight.
Okay.
Make sure you pick up his book, Fighting for Survival, Conquering Cancer and the African American Patient, available now. And for Stop, Look, and Listen, I'm your host, LaTroy Gardner. See you next week. Peace and blessings.